Good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started. For those coming back from yesterday's wonderful session, we welcome you back. We do have a few new people joining us today, so we're going to do a few kind of introductions and housekeeping to get the day started. My name is Stuart Spencer, and I'm the Executive Director for the Lodi Winegrape Commission. And we are delighted today to be working with the SommFoundation and Elaine Brown in hosting this Lodi Wine Masterclass. Just a little background for everyone that wasn't here yesterday. We conceived of these Lodi Wine Masterclasses a couple years ago, and when we started discussing it, I couldn't think of a better person to lead this session than Elaine Chukan Brown. Elaine, I think, first came to Lodi about 2012 when she was getting started in her wine career, and she's dove into our region more so than anyone I've ever seen from a media perspective. And so when we asked her to do this, she was excited to do it, and spent another probably 2 to 3 weeks doing background research to be prepared for these sessions. And we launched them last winter, pre-COVID, and we did one in Washington, DC in February in Houston, and then we headed to Denver in early March, and then all the craziness ensued, and we find ourselves here today doing virtual master classes. But we had a very delightful session yesterday with 3 of our local growers and vintners, as well as Elaine talking about old vines and Zinfandel. And today we're going to take it another direction. And I'm delighted to have 3 of my colleagues here, Ben, Sue, and Markus. I think they're going to be very insightful as we move through the morning. But first, I'd like to offer a thanks to Jay Fletcher and the SommFoundation for this partnership. I think it's been a great one for Lodi. We had originally intended for people to come to Lodi and visit us for a Somm camp for several days, and we are very hopeful that we will be able to do that again in the future. But they've been a great partner in this, and I just want to highlight, we have some scholarships that are going to come out of this for a test you'll be taking afterwards, and I think Jay's going to give us a few details on that in a minute. But they're giving out over $150,000 in scholarships annually to aspiring wine somms and educators. And so I think it's a great opportunity, and we're delighted to have you here today. And I'm delighted to have Elaine, and I'm going to hand it off to Elaine for our class today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Stuart. I just want to take a minute to really talk to you, Jay, before we get started talking about Lodi, because I think it's really important that we highlight the scholarship work that SommFoundation is doing. And I know actually this year, especially, SommFoundation has instigated a couple of new scholarships. And, so thank you for the enormous contributions SommFoundation's making to the industry in that way. But I was hoping you could tell us about some of the other scholarship work that you're doing and some of the new scholarships that you started this year as well.
Thanks, Elaine. And I also want to say yesterday was a fantastic session. Your moderating was fantastic. Your knowledge of the area with the winemakers it blew me away. Prior to that session, I used to think that maybe the best Zinfandel from America came from Dry Creek. But after tasting those fantastic wines yesterday and retasting them last night, I was just blown away by the complexity, the finesse, and the power of all of those wines. And I now am a true believer that the greatest Zinfandel and some of the greatest wines of America come from Lodi. So thanks for enlightening me with that.
And that's the end of today's seminar. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We have plenty more to share, but it's great to hear.
It's super interesting, and it's super cool. And, I have to say I'm remiss for not being more well-read on Lodi. But I am now, after studying it a little bit myself for the last few weeks, I'm a big fan, and with the people too, because a lot of it's about the people and the land and the farmers, and I get that. The SommFoundation is something that we started some years ago. I've been a master sommelier since 1996, and one of my benefactors and friends that mentored me was a wealthy Aspen man named Jeff Johnson, and he saw the work that I did with my friends and how my life improved by studying and trying to become a master sommelier. and supported me with some of the greatest wines in the world. He would taste Domaine de Romanée-Conti, Le Pin, Petrus, Chave with me on a regular basis. And when he saw, what happened to my life and the training and the help that we gave to everyone else, he donated $1 million worth of wine to us about 15 years ago. With that donation, we started doing charitable fundraising events with the wine, and then taking the money and giving it to students that were aspiring for different accreditations, whether it be the Society of Wine Educators or the Court of Master Sommeliers or the Institute of Master of Wine. With that started the Guild of Sommeliers Education Foundation, which is really kind of a separate thing. It's a website based on, education. And the Guild of Sommeliers Education Foundation does a really great educational website. The SommFoundation, I think a lot of people don't really understand, is separate. We're a separate nonprofit, and the only thing that we really do is charitable work. So we help people by mentoring and helping them with enrichment trips, and this is supposed to be, we're supposed to have students in Lodi right now visiting the vineyards, and that's what we do. We sent people on in the last few years about 22, 25, 30 trips around the world, all expenses paid, to Italy, to France, to Spain, to Portugal, different parts of America. And so we do these charitable things. We get a certain amount of an administration fee for that. We kind of live on fumes. I do educational events around the country with our wine cellar, raising money, and then the money goes back into scholarship fund. It's been difficult for us with COVID. And, so we do these virtual things, but as far as fundraising goes, it's pretty grim actually lately. And we're trying to survive, but we're a great organization. We do a lot of great things. We give a lot of different monies out for different things. What I'd like you to do is go to our website. We have a SommFoundation website. It's fantastic. There's a lot of things that go on there. And we launched last fall a thing called the Global Wine Diagram by my friend Greg Van Wagner here in Aspen. And what he's really done is almost taken an image, a Google Earth type format, and he's traced out all the great vineyards of the world on Google Earth. And it is so much information, it's crazy. And for you guys that are into maps and map reading, this particular tool is really, really cool because you can actually look at the earth. You can actually zoom down and look at your wineries. You can look at the structures on the ground in Lodi and then see the sub-appellations, that he has traced out by hand and marked. There's thousands of pin with data on there. So please go to our website. Please, if you can, support the SommFoundation with minimal donation of some sort. We try to do good work. That's all we do. And we're really happy to be a part of the Wines of Lodi and this great seminar.
Thank you. I know, I'm lucky enough to know a lot of people across a whole range of experience in their careers. And I know quite a few people that have been helped in their wine education and experience through SommFoundation. So thank you for the work that you do. But we also have a special opportunity that Lodi and SommFoundation are collaborating on with a scholarship opportunity given through these webinars through a test. Could you tell us a little bit about how that's going to work and what people need to know?
Well, after our session today, we're going to send you a link to a quiz on the Wines of Lodi. And so we put some great factual information on there. We put some historical and anecdotal things on there. It's a pretty fun test. And it's a time test. So there's something like, I think, 53 or 54 questions. And the winner, I believe, gets a $1,500 in cash money. And then I think it's $700 or $500 for first, second, and third. And then everyone also gets the top 7 under that get a year's access to the Global Wine Diagram. So we're giving away the Global Wine Diagram to the top 10, and then the top 3 get cash, and the other 7 get the Global Wine Diagram. So pay attention today. Oh, diagram goes to top 7. Other people get cash. Thanks, Lynn. Lynn, my wife, by the way, she is the managing director of the SommFoundation. Basically, she does all the work. She does a really great job. So take that test. Pay attention to what everybody's saying today. There might be a few questions that only apply to what people have said. So you total wine geeks might miss it if you don't pay attention. But anyway, have fun with the test. I think it's going to be a blast, and I'm really looking forward to this session today.
Great, thank you so much. So just quick recap, there will be, if you are registered, you do have to be a registered attendee of the webinars. If you are registered, you will receive an email as soon as today's webinar is done, and you can then sign into the test and take it. You'll have a little over 50 questions, and the people that have the most right answers in the shortest amount of time will be considered winners. And so you have about 20 minutes total to answer 50 some questions. As Jay mentioned, some of the questions are very specific to the webinars, but there's a lot of historical information. And I have been making a point of seeding in answers to the questions in the webinars. So we'll keep doing that today. So anyways, thank you so much, Jay, for the work that you're doing with SommFoundation and for the work that you're doing in collaboration with the Lodi Winegrape Commission. So it's great that people can use these webinars as yet another scholarship opportunity. So let's go ahead and get started today. We're going to talk about Lodi. Yesterday, we spent a good amount of time looking just at reds, specifically Zinfandel and kind of historic varieties. We talked a little bit about head-trained versus wire-trained vineyards, how mainly the Macallan River and Clements Hills areas deal with differ and what growing conditions are there. We talked about east side versus west side character traits that we see in Zinfandel. And today I'm really excited because we are going to dig into farming some more, but specifically around white wines. And we'll talk a little bit about white wine making, but really we're going to talk about white wines and farming, and we'll dig into the different nested AVAs and growing areas of Lodi today as well. I'm thrilled to have our guests today. Ben Kolber, KC Vineyard Management, works with vineyards all over the AVA and uniquely is actually speaking to us today from the Delta region, which any of you that were with us yesterday heard a good amount about, and we'll talk about even more today. So it's really quite fun to have Ben here to hear about some of the sub-AVAs and growing areas, what farming in Lodi is like, and especially what it's like to farm below sea level. We'll get into that later. Markus Bokisch, also incredible Lodi grower and has his own label, Bokisch Vineyards. We're going to start with his wine in a minute, but Markus has done an incredible job also farming in different AVAs and really even helping to develop understanding of some of the newer growing areas of Lodi. And so we're going to get to dig into some of the east side AVAs of Lodi today with Markus and what it's like to farm at elevation, what it's like to farm with rocks, and even a little bit about some of the unique environmental concerns that come up with farming in Lodi, and learn more about how people work with those kinds of issues, trying to be really conscious of best land use practices. And then with Sue from Acquiesce, brilliant winemaker, and interestingly devoted to white wine especially. She also makes a beautiful rosé. But one of the really fun things to do in Lodi is to go to her Acquiesce Winery and not only taste her wines, but actually have the food pairings that she's developed herself in her kitchen there in Lodi. And there's you're one of the few places in the United States where you can get genuine Dijon mustard. So I recommend people make sure to contact her and ask for that. But we're going to have a great discussion today. And Jay, of course, is going to be here to help us talk through the wines that we're seeing again. So we're going to start off talking about a flight of whites, and then we're going to look at 2 reds. Yesterday, we started to get into kind of some of the other unexpected varieties of Lodi. We touched on that just a little bit, but we're going to really focus in on that more today and really talk through the other kind of the incredible diversity of growing conditions and varieties that can grow in Lodi's Mediterranean climate. You might notice I just dropped you a test answer there in the last thing I said. I'm about to drop another one. So Lodi actually grows the greatest number of wine grape varieties in the state of California. Well over 100 different wine grape varieties are actually grown in Lodi. And some of that diversity is actually really importantly, thanks to you, Markus. You've actually drawn on your own heritage from Spain and your time growing up, going back and forth between Spain and the United States to then import really unique perspective on farming because of your family's background farming there, but also a host of Iberian varieties, some of which you were the first one to bring in. So could you do be sure to unmute, but let's go ahead and just start with that. You know, your work with Iberian varieties there in Lodi, you've really helped some of the varieties you've really been the one to bring in for the first time. And some of them also, you've been the one to really show how successful they can be in the unique growing conditions of Lodi. So could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. And thank you for allowing me to participate with this class. I think it's fantastic and it's bringing Lodi to a whole new level. Initially, what I've always done, you know, my family immigrated here to California, and it seems that my life's trajectory has been to try to marry my Spanish roots on my mom's side to my California roots. And so that's been a lifelong project that really manifested itself in its strongest way when I got into the wine business. And it wasn't immediate, but it was after actually going to Spain and living and working in the wine business that I realized, you know, I'd like to bring the wine portion of my Spanish heritage back to California. That's something that I think could be very cross-cultural and very interesting, given that California itself has a lot of Spanish history in it, with the arrival of the Spaniards here, bringing the missions, bringing mission wine, etc. But they didn't bring the good stuff. And so I was going to bring the good stuff. And so over the course of my time, which was initially in Napa, I thought, where do I want to start? I was working in wineries in Napa, and where do I want to start in California where I can actually make a footprint, make a difference, and bring some of my Spanish culture home? And Lodi became the place that I chose. And I looked at many different areas all over California. So back in 1995, we purchased our first piece of land. And I think one of the fortunate things that I had is that I got to choose where I wanted to have that land. And I wanted to choose it specifically based on Mediterranean varietals. So instead of going anywhere, we decided to go into some of the most nutrient depleted soils that you can find in the Lodi area. And that brought me to the east side. And by the way, having decided that we were going to move to Lodi was the first step, but then looking for the specific area within Lodi that I thought would be best suited initially to Iberian varietals, Mediterranean varietals in particular, I realized the complexity and the difference of what was generally known as the Lodi AVA, but in reality is 7 very distinct areas, and then subsets within those 7 distinct areas. So we went to the Clements area, way to the east side. Our vineyards are anywhere between 100 to 300 foot elevations. The soils are either derivatives of the Macallan River alluvium, or they get into these really cobbly or gravelly, what are called redding soil series. And all of those tend to be very red, very iron oxidized, low nutrient value, and easy to tame the relatively high vigor that you would find in Mediterranean varietals. So
right.
Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and just to give people some perspective on where we're talking about, let's go ahead and pull up the maps and just talk through them for a second and then come back to talking about the different varieties.
Good idea.
Yeah, so if we, and actually let's go ahead and Kayla and go back one slide. And I talked about the Delta breezes a little bit yesterday, but I just want to be sure to revisit this point because it also connects into some of the soil variation that Markus is talking about in another way. So we've pulled this map, and again, some of you saw this yesterday, but this is a zoomed in map. You can see there on the left, there's the San Francisco Bay, which connects to a large bay complex. So San Francisco Bay bulbs out in the north to San Pablo Bay. As many of you know, San Pablo Bay is the very southernmost part of both Sonoma County and Napa Valley. And then as we move east, a series of other smaller bays emerge, and they link directly into the intersection zone of the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers. The San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers are the two biggest rivers in California. They come directly out of the Sierra foothills in the east. The Sierra foothills, again, are a big bank or wall of mountains that border the eastern side of California. And that's really important to the growing conditions in the state as a whole, because they protect us from the more severe continental growing conditions of inland United States. But then on the far western side of the state of California, we have another bank or wall of mountains, which is the coastal range. And effectively, between these two mountain ranges, the coastal in the west and the Sierra foothills in the east, we have the Central Valley. The Central Valley is a really long, sweeping valley that goes a huge length of the state. And where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers come out of the Sierra foothills, they cross the Central Valley and then intersect in that bay complex that emerges into San Francisco Bay. And between the two, where the rivers intersect the bays, there's this incredible webbing of smaller rivers and smaller waterways that create what we call the California Delta region. The reason this matters, and the reason I want to focus on this map, is you can see there between the ends of the two arrows, all of these like weaving, winding waterways. That is actually where the California Delta region rests. It's again where these rivers intersect with the bay. And much of the Delta region is actually below sea level, interestingly enough. There's incredible water management issues to protect some of the land formations that are there in the Delta to keep them from being flooded by water. But that Delta complex actually goes all the way into the westernmost part of Lodi itself and into the actual Lodi AVA itself. And part of why this matters is because of what we talked about yesterday, the weather conditions. So Lodi sits at the entrance to the Central Valley. Part of what I mean by that is that where the delta, where the water system hits the Central Valley, that's where Lodi sits. And that matters because the San Francisco Bay and the Bay Complex creates an open place in the coastal mountain range, which makes it so that the very, very cold Pacific Ocean influence pushes all the way through the entrance to the Central Valley where Lodi sits. So as we talked about yesterday, every single day Lodi is hit with delta breezes. We try to make them sound friendly by calling them breezes. In fact, by late afternoon, they're proper wind. So the delta breezes have a profoundly strong cooling effect. And they're actually strong and persistent enough and reliable enough that an enormous windmill complex sits outside of Lodi within the rush of the delta breezes and helps provide power to a big part of the state of California. The other reason, though, it matters to talk about how Lodi sits at this entrance to the Central Valley is because this intersection of rivers, Sacramento and San Joaquin being the most significant, and then within Lodi, there's also the Cosumnes and the Macallan. So these four rivers together with the Delta complex create a great variation of soils across the AVAs within Lodi. So if we could go forward to the next map. So now Markus has been talking about the different subzones of Lodi and the different AVAs there. And so Markus, you were saying that you're in Clements Hills, but I know you're also farming in other AVAs too. So could you just kind of walk us through where your vineyards are located and a little bit about how these different nested AVAs that you work in differ?
Absolutely. So within the Lodi AVA, we farm in the Clements Hills AVA, which is that salmon-colored AVA on the southeast corner. We also farm on the Borden Ranch AVA, the yellow AVA, and in Slough House, the furthest north. We also farm in the Jayhant AVA, which is located kind of like smack in the middle, the hole in the donut, if you will. And then if you look at the Macallan River AVA, that is really the area where you'll find the greatest amount of old vine Zinfandels, and it is really where all of the vineyard history of Lodi began before it spread eastward and northward, and for that matter, even westward into the Delta. So we farm in a majority of the AVAs. We find them to be really unique. And when we decided to understand a little bit more what Lodi was, again, when we moved to Lodi, because we wanted to figure out exactly what soil type we wanted to be planting on, we discovered there was just a plethora of soil types and climatic conditions, and that they should all be studied. Initially, with the beginning of the studying of the AVAs, the thought, this was in the late 90s, the thought was, well, we're farming in Clemens, so what makes Clemens different from everything else? One thing I discovered about Lodi very early on is the cooperative spirit of all the growers. Mm-hmm. And it would be much easier to find out the distinctions between Clemens and the rest of Lodi if we actually took all of Lodi and started looking at its component parts. And so we created a subcommittee that was populated with people from all over the area, growers from all over the area, and cooperatively over a period of years, we put together, through the use of science and history, 7 distinct AVAs. So if you walk through them a little bit, you'll notice that the 3 AVAs furthest to the east are, while they are at the toe of the Central Valley, a lot of their soil types, a lot of the topography is much more similar to what you would find in the Sierra foothills. And then working your way to the middle of the AVAs, so let's say the Macallan River and Jayhant, you get the rivers that are now going from the high Sierras, getting closer and closer to the Delta, and what they're depositing is finer and finer silts. And so you get these beautiful clay loams and some sandy loams that get deposited depending on what river you're on. So if you're on the Macallan River, which basically works its way through the high Sierras, through these big granite batholiths, you get a lot of sand, and you get these beautiful sandy loams, young soils that the old vine Zinfandels are planted on. And then you travel even further and further west, and you get into some really, really, really fine silts. And then you get in formed underwater essentially over millennia. So you get higher organic matter, which is, for example, a lot of the soils that Ben is so intimately familiar with. So you have from east to west a great variety of soil types. The ones on the east having a lot of gravel and cobble. The ones in the middle are very fine sands and silt loams. And the ones closer to the west would be heavier clay or organic matter soils. Then you have climatic differences through the region, because the more you go from, let's take it from west to east now, the further away you get from the Delta. So the soils and the sites that are more towards the west have a really, I mean, talk about Delta winds. On the west side, you've got much stronger winds than you have on the east side for the most part. As you get to the east, you also have some cold air drainage from the high Sierras, and you get some more distinct diurnal fluctuations. So you have that climatic distinction that goes from west to east. But then another really important thing, which Elaine has alluded to, has been very clear on, is that we have this very long Central Valley composed of 2 valleys, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. And all those areas, those 500-mile stretch, has that coastal wall that doesn't allow for maritime influence into the Central Valley, except in that one spot in 500 miles that breaks from the Carquinez Strait that connects the valley to San Pablo Bay. Mm-hmm. And that one funnel is the one area where all the wind comes through. And so you have from basically just around the city of Sacramento to about the city of Stockton, you have this maritime influence in this one very discrete area in a 500-mile stretch of one enormous valley that really makes Lodi so unique.
Well, and it's really fascinating and significant. And so I often say that while Lodi is not a coastal region, it is a coastally influenced region. And it's very much because of that opening that you're describing that goes from through the Golden Gate, across the San Francisco Bay, through San Pablo Bay, all the way through the Strait, the Delta region, and right into Lodi. And like you said, it's the only part of this 500-mile long Central Valley that has a coastal influence in that way. The rest of the Central Valley going north and south is quite a bit warmer. So just to summarize a quick version of the kind of AVA differences, the western part of Lodi is the coolest. It's closest to the Delta. It has the strongest direct wind influence. There's importantly wind in the east as well, but also because it has cooler soils, because the clay content is generally higher in that western part as well. But then as you move east, and then especially northeast, the potential daytime temperatures increase. but the elevation also increases. And that has two effects. It creates generally rockier soils, bonier soils, less clay content, but also as the elevations increase, you end up with higher potential daytime temperatures, but also lower potential nighttime temperatures. So my recollection is Slough House has the biggest diurnal shift, but also the coldest winter. Is that right?
Slough houses, yes. Slough House in the Linden area can get colder because they're further away from the delta. And you can actually take a look at different species, like for example, almond production in our area, and you can actually trace the amount of tonnage of almonds based on chill hours, which directly correlates to exactly what you're saying on areas that are colder pockets in Lodi and areas that are warmer pockets in Lodi in that diurnal fluctuation.
Yeah.
So you have to think about Slough House also being the furthest away from the Carquinez influence. And so those delta breezes kick in about half hour to about an hour after they've already reached the city of Lodi.
Right. But then importantly, Borden Ranch, which is one nested AVA south of Slough House, does still have actually, because of where it's situated, the wind kind of passes right over it. But then, but then the soils are, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, the delta breezes pass through the entire region. So we're talking about nuances. So the stronger winds are typically more towards the west. They're a little bit lighter, maybe slightly warmer by the time they get to the east, but we're talking nuances at that point.
Right.
So in terms of soil type, you're talking about soils that were developed in very, very different times. So the eastern soils that tend to be more volcanic in their origin are soils that can date from 250 to 500,000 years old. And the oldest soils we have in Lodi are those that are located on the Borden Ranch. And then you get younger soils, for example, those sandy loams that are developed from the Macallan River Basin that basically define the center of and the traditional area of Lodi. The soils are between 25,000 to maybe 50,000 years old at the tops. So 1/10 the age. And then you get into the delta soils that are even younger than that. And not to make any connection between quality of wines and age of soil, but for example, we have Albarino on 3 different soil types, one volcanic, one sandy loam in the middle, and one in the delta. And the aromatic profiles of those wines, while all distinctly Albarino, are all distinctly different. And it's really exciting to see that.
Well, and we'll talk about that more in a minute too, but let's go ahead and start looking at wine and use the wine to give context to some of this information we're sharing. And so the first wine we're going to look at is the Bokisch Verdejo. And so this is actually, again, an eastern side vineyard, but in what we're calling the Borden Ranch AVA. And so I have to confess, I'm so excited about about today. I absolutely love white wine. Of course I love red wine, but white wine can be so incredibly energizing and energetic. And I'm going to confess I am tired these days. And so to go ahead and start at 10 in the morning being told, no, drink white wine, it's fine. It's just is a lot of fun. So, but go ahead, tell us about this site, but also this variety in Lodi and this variety at Clay Station Vineyard in Borden Ranch.
Yeah, so Verdejo is a variety that I've wanted to plant for years and years and years, but it's actually one of the latest ones in our lineup because I had a trouble finding a good source of budwood. Verdejo, for those of you I'm sure you know, comes from northwestern Spain in an area called Rueda. If you were to land in Madrid airport and drive towards Galicia, you would pass right through the area of Rueda. It has very little to do with Lodi in terms of climate, soils, and whatnot. The vineyards there tend to be planted in the 2,000-foot elevation on high limestone mesas, and there's huge diurnal fluctuation in that area. We brought Verdejo to Lodi because of our successes with other varieties. I think a lot of people initially thought, well, you can't bring cool climate Albarino and grow a good example in Lodi. And so we had to fight back a little bit on acceptance of these varieties by the general market. I think one of the things that I was struck on before we get too much into the Verdejo is that when we came to Lodi, I thought with our winery we would be probably 3/4% or 3/4 of our wines would be red wines and 1/4 would be white wines that we would offer because people would want to try white renditions of Spanish varietals. We are actually currently at about 55% sales and 45% red wines. And that to me, I could never have predicted initially. And it shows, I think, not only the consumer willingness to try interesting new white varieties from new regions, but also how well white varieties do as a whole throughout all of Lodi. I think I never would have expected, having come into this region, knowing that Zinfandel and other varieties were doing so well, and you never really heard much about the whites. So Verdejo. Verdejo is unique because it has real phenolic aspects to it. It's a very complex wine in the mouthfeel, and it also has a fair amount of complexity aromatically. One of the things that I think distinctly makes Verdejo unique is its mouthfeel. And one of the things that the Spaniards do is they do extended skin contact time prior to fermentation, anywhere up to 2 days. We started experimenting with that, and we found that we could create more of a phenolic environment in the flavors if we had extended skin contact time. But in Lodi, with no skin contact time, you still get this really interesting complexity in the mouthfeel. So this variety's proven itself, I think, to be very at home in Lodi. And if you blind test it, as we have our Verdejos with Verdejos from Reda, you'd be hard pressed to tell them apart. So the site is classic Borden Ranch. So the vineyard sits at about 170-foot elevation. It's located on the western edge of the Borden Ranch AVA, rolling hills, very gravelly, about 1/2 inch to 2 inch gravel throughout the site, very well drained, helps keep the Verdejo tamed and very well balanced. And it receives that certainly strong diurnal fluctuation that most of Borden Ranch reaches because of its proximity to the foothills.
Well, let's go ahead and Kayla's got some soil photos pulled up that we can look at. And so we can look at kind of the differences here. So again, looking at Borden Ranch first, this is, this particular Verdejo is grown in this Borden Ranch type soil. And importantly, you'll notice how red it is. This is again, coming from volcanic parent material, but notice too how incredibly rocky it is. Are there other comments you want to make on these soils in Borden Ranch?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment that if you look at the cobbles and if you look at the gravel, you'll notice that there are no sharp edges to those rocks. They're smoothed out like they've been put into a tumbler. And the reason for that is that the soils, the volcanic soils that we have in the eastern part of the Lodi AVAs were not made there. They were brought into the valley through erosional processes with the uplifting of the Sierra Nevadas, with the crashing of the tectonic plates. So you've got all this these tectonic activities that are pushing up the Sierras, and then you have the sloughing off in a time when there was much higher rainfall of all these muds and rocks into the Central Valley. And all of that smoothed out the edges of the stones. If you were to clean off that soil, you would see that most of it is different granites, very rosy red granites or clear white granites. So it's an indication that the soil actually wasn't developed here. It was brought down here through geologic activity.
Right. And so let's just briefly look at, we have soil slides for a couple of the other Eastern AVAs as well. So how, immediately this is far less red from Slough House. Are there other comments you want to make about the soils in this AVA?
Well, Slough House is, it's an interesting AVA because it has the Cosumnes River that runs all the way through it. And you could look at all the acres that are planted in Slough House AVA and see that most of the vineyard acres are planted actually in this one sliver of Slough House AVA that is typified by the alluvial deposits of the Cosumnes River. So this is very classic to that. But as well, in different parts of the AVA, mostly to the north and to the south, you will get, again, back into the Redding soils.
Right. Yeah.
But if you looked at the majority of the vineyards in Schoolhouse, that's that.
Right. Okay, great. And I think we had Clement Sills here just for contrast too. And again, notice how red it is. And again, notice the rounded edges of the cobbles and gravels there as well. So let's go ahead, Jay. You know, you have the Verdejo there. I think Verdejo is not a first guess variety for anybody in relation to Lodi, but I love this wine, and it's an exciting vineyard in my mind too. It's been really fun to visit this vineyard for me, but also to taste other winemakers' expressions of this wine too. I've gotten to have a number of wines from Clay Station, which is a lot of fun for me. But Jay, what are your first impressions just smelling and tasting this particular Bokisch Verdejo?
You know, this is such a refreshing change to Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc that we produce so much in America. Beautiful nose of lemon, lime, peach. I got a great rocky minerality, fresh pear. I get peach blossom, apple blossom, that stone and rock coming through. There's a slight nose of fresh green herb. On a palate, medium plus acidity, crisp. I get more kind of lime and tart tangerine and fresh pear on the palate. That rocky minerality is really coming through. Again, with light, fresh green herbs, like maybe fresh chives. There's a weight on this wine, a richness on the back palate. I'm guessing it's lees contact. I don't believe there's any oak on this wine, but it could be, you know, it could be a barrel mixed in or something. But I think this is oak lees driven, which gives it a lot of weight. There's just a touch of bitterness on the wine, which gives it a great power at the end. I'm really enjoying this wine. I think it's awesome. I'd like to be sitting outside having fish tacos or a seafood platter or fresh lemon sole. And this is delicious and refreshing and really well made.
Thank you. So one of my very favorite things to do is to pour white wines of Lodi for people, because they're always surprised and then they always get excited. You know, it's like consistent, the kind of energy and freshness. And part of what I love about this wine too. I mean, first of all, let me draw a big highlight circle around how many different notes you just made, which implies a ton of complexity in the wine. But also, I loved your comment about there being a little bit of weight, because I think what's one of the things that's unique about this wine, and I see commonly in white wines of Lodi, is this combination of there's just enough weight on the palate so the flavors make contact, but the acidity is so high it still races through and rinses the mouth. And for me, that combination makes me want to really keep going back and tasting. But so Markus, could you just tell us briefly about winemaking choices here?
Yeah, I think we're not fans of acid addition, and so we like to pick in low sugar. So the Verdejo typically will come in at anywhere between 21.5 to 22.5 bricks, with an ideal of 22. And you can see that in the total alcohol in the wine. So we also do a very cold fermentation, 50 degrees, typically bubbles away over about a 3-week period. We have done natural fermentations, and we've had yeast additions, and we've been playing around a lot with that. Haven't really settled on anything yet there. I think one of the things that adds to that weight, which Jay mentioned, and I think he's right on, is that we do some lees stirring on neutral oak, white oak barrels. We also use acacia. So we have neutral acacia barrels that we use specifically for the Verdejo that we have found does not work with any other white varieties we do. But for the Verdejo, for whatever reasons, it tends to add a little floral or cut flower component to the aromatics. We have, I would say, probably 10% goes into acacia, 30% goes into neutral white oak, and then the balance is stainless steel, and we compose our blends after that.
Are there big differences that you would comment in terms of expression that you see between just briefly, but between typicity that you're seeing from this variety in Lodi versus in Spain?
I think, and from the very beginning, we were really concerned of having an overly expressive rendition of Verdejo, because ultimately, if you think of if you think that Madrid is at the latitude of Seattle, right? And Breda is north of Madrid. So, and here we are sitting in sunny California at a lower latitude, closer to the equator. We're like, we experienced this with our Albareños, where instead of getting a real lemony citrus, sometimes we get this sweet tangerine, which is still within what you would expect, but it would be more like more of an interior Albarino that you would get in Galicia. So with Verdejo, we were concerned about that. So we did no skin contact time for quite a few years, completely different to what they were doing in Verdejo, in Breda. When we started adding skin contact time, we lost our fear of an overly expressive wine. We realized that the Verdejo was going to do what it was going to do anyhow. So it wasn't quite as influenced by the climatic differences of the two sites. So we haven't been quite as aggressive as 2-day full skin contact time. We've kept it to, I think the most we did was 12 hours, and that's plenty for us. We find that we have a nice balance there.
Well, and so I think, Jay, that speaks a little bit to that, just an accent of bitterness right at the end, that too.
I think the varietal has a slight bitterness, kind of like Pinot Grigio anyway. That makes sense with the old oak, because there's that slight creaminess there. So you're going, is this all leaves, or is this a little bit of, it's really pretty. And you think about the wines from Spain, typically, Martí de Riscal was really the ones that, really pioneered that region and did it. You see most of those wines have a little bit more oak. They're a little bit more, as Spanish wines do, they're oaky.
But I like the transparency that Markus is bringing with avoiding the new oak on this one.
Absolutely. We don't need to do that. We do that enough in other places to take away the beautiful fruit on this wine.
So Ben, I'm going to pull you forward now. I want to, as we move into talking about the second wine, we're going to draw on Markus some more to talk about Albarino specifically, but I would love for, if Kayla could pull up the AVA map again. And Ben, if you could tell us, because we're shifting now with the second wine, the Oak Farm Albarino is coming entirely from some of the Western nested AVAs. So Ben, I was hoping you could kind of, as we look at this map, that you could kind of talk us through what you're seeing in growing conditions and farming differences there with some of the more Western facing nested AVAs of Lodi.
Sure, absolutely. And just to refer, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be on this panel with all the wonderful speakers. And Elaine, thank you for inviting me. But to talk about the soils, it's funny because Markus referred to them, how the vines grow, but that's actually how I figure out who's driving around Lodi, because all farmers drive a white pickup. And during the winter, Markus has a red soil on his pickup, and we have the dark gray soils from the Delta. And so we know who's who just by that. So it's a pretty fun fact around Lodi. We farm a lot, like you said, on the west side of Lodi, mainly in the Delta, in the Macallan River region there. And quite different, even from the Delta region. We call the Delta region, which is that gray western area that's kind of unnamed, where it says Lodi AVA on the map. We're actually the very farthest west vineyard in that area.
So just to quickly clarify, I want to make sure people understand. So there's two gray areas. Those do fall within the Lodi AVA. So the larger Lodi AVA is the outer border, and within the Lodi AVA are 7 nested AVAs, which we've been talking about. But just to quickly clarify what Ben is referencing, there are also these 2 small areas that are within the Lodi AVA, but are not in an additional nested AVA. And so the part of the Delta region actually sits within the Lodi AVA. And as I mentioned earlier, Ben is actually currently in the Delta region, and he farms the westernmost vineyard in Lodi, which is there in the Delta on that border that we can see there. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the westernmost vineyards. But so I am here today and on the home ranch in the Delta. And I was just scrolling through some of the commentary and the notes. And Randall mentioned about sandhill cranes. Right next to us here is a big preserve. And right now is when the sandhills are flying over. And so it's one of my most favorite places to be at this time, because you can hear the sandhills flying over at this time. So it's pretty interesting fact here, which goes to a lot of the water that's around here and a lot of the areas that pool up in a lot of those little webbings that you're speaking to. There's a lot of wildlife that formed here. As far as soils, Delta, it's fantastic. Soils here are very, very organic soils. If you can imagine that Delta was built over the turn of the century between 1800 and 1900, the Delta was primarily row crop land, and the farmers would hand build dikes in the Delta area to keep the fall rain runoff from building up so they can have long for their crops to grow. And naturally, those dikes got bigger and bigger. And at the turn of the century, they were built into the Delta levee system that we have today. So before the Delta levee system, over winter, the Delta would flood. It'd be big marshland where you'd have tules and lots of aquatic wildlife and plant, and they would dry up and they would basically compost into the ground, and we have this huge layer of Delta peat, the probably first 2 to 3 feet in some areas that is just strictly peat. Well, later when these levee systems became very strong, we figured out that underneath that peat is a nice mixture of sandy loam and other sediments, that if we get a good mix of this soil, we have fantastic soils to build for vineyards. So in fact, that's what we do. We take a big cultivator plow and we mix these soils, and we create some of the finest fertile soils in the area. Fantastic water holding capacity. And like you said, the weather here is fantastic. We do get that cool breeze early on in the day, but we still have wonderful weather for ripening here.
Well, and so Kayla, could you actually, we have a photo of Ben with his son in the Delta that I just think is so beautiful. And it gives you a sense of what it looks like walking on the levee versus where the vineyard land is located.
Yeah, so we're pointing over our Zinfandel field along the Delta, and that Zinfandel field is just about 17 feet below sea level. So we are standing maybe 4 feet above the mean water line, and looking down at the vineyard from there.
It was a really fun evening. My daughter Rachel and I spent a second half of the day just walking the levee and hanging out on the water there in the Delta. Really beautiful area. But let's go ahead and kind of pull east a little bit and tell us just briefly, what is it really important for us to know about Cosumnes and versus Macallan, for example, those two AVAs.
Yeah, and Markus might be able to comment more on the Cosumnes, but on the Macallan, we have fantastic deep sandy soils. In fact, we are planting a new vineyard, and we just did some soil pits, and we have to really dig down far to get any kind of change in soil. So as far as north of us, maybe Markus could comment more to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great.
Sure. Yeah. If you look at like the Cosumnes River and the Macallan River, they cut through very, very different areas of the high Sierras. And again, everything that we're farming are alluvial fans of erosion events that occurred in the high Sierras. So whatever the Cosumnes cuts through, it'll deposit. Whatever the Macallan cuts through, it'll deposit. And those deposits are distinctly different. So like what Ben is farming and experiencing, which is this beautiful combination of, this deep sands that are pretty limitless. They go down very far. They all derive from the Macallan River. And it's fun to look at a topo map of the high Sierras, because if you just if you blindly just followed the high Sierras with your fingers on a topo map, you would find the biggest ridge, the biggest gash in the entire Sierras was created by the Macallan River. So it delved way down deep into the granites. And those granites are the deposits that create, for example, those real sandy, decomposed granites of the Shenandoah Valley to the east of us. And then as it comes down into the valley, it deposits a bit finer sands, and then finer sands still, and deeper. So I personally live in the Macallan River AVA. And at one point we were we were doing some soil studies with a backhoe. We went 20 feet down until we got below the sand deposits. So tremendous depth of sand.
Right.
But then you go further and further, like if you go to the Cosumnes River and you see what it's bringing down, it's going through not granites, but it's cutting through basalt, completely different rock, a rock that degrades into clays and clay loams. And so you tend to get a little bit heavier of a soil as the further west you go along the Cosumnes. Right. You don't see hardly any sand. Right. Because that Cosumnes River has never gotten into the granites of the High Sierras, so it's not depositing those sands.
So we do want to keep moving and talking about the wines themselves, but there are two questions that have come in that I have one for each of you to address briefly. So Ben, in relation to the delta, since it is below sea level, that's going to change how the water table interacts with the vines in the vineyard. And so one of the questions that's come up is, do you have any issues based on the height of the water table or any issues in relation to like anything like root rot or root exposure to that water table?
Fantastic question. We've learned to adapt with issues. So a lot of the delta now is tile drained. We developed districts that have, we call them reclamation ditches that we actually pump more water out back into the delta from those ditches than we actually use. So it's pretty interesting. And we put tile drains through the vineyards that will keep our root zone, our 5 to 6 to 7 feet root zone, free of standing water. And not only does that help keep the water level down, but it helps flush any kind of salts or any kind of irons that come in with that tidal flow and helps flush out through the delta. So our irrigation practices in the delta are not just adding water, it's figuring out how to make sure that the roots are healthy.
Right. And so that's an important thing to note, is that delta area actually contributes to they're actually putting water back into the system rather than pulling it out, which is really kind of interesting. And then Markus, just very briefly, because we do need to manage time here, but can you speak to, as you're farming in the West, you had mentioned how the kind of gravelly soils in the East naturally devigorate some of these vines, but then how about as you move west, do you see any kind of vigor issues that you need to be aware of?
I think that one of my my assumptions when I came to Lodi was that the volcanic soils on the east are going to be the most depleted soils and the less vigorous soils. In fact, most of the sandy loams that are located in the heart of the Macallan River area are not that vigorous of soils. And that's why when you take a look at the old vine zins, they're very well in balance. When you take a look at a lot of the vineyards in that area, their balance is actually very appropriate. And then if you know how to manage your water, as the growers like Ben on the west side know how to do, which is basically drain tiling your property and keeping the water away from your root zones as much as possible, you can then control vigor as well. Right. I will say though that it's harder to have a very high production vineyard on the poorer soils on the east side than it is on the west side because of your access to water. Right. But some of our the most popular Albarino we have in our tasting room is actually a vineyard that's below sea level, located in the California Delta. Right. So, it's also different flavor profiles that get created, and then the consumer gets to pick and choose what they like.
So just to clarify one question or one point, just because it does relate to the question that came in. So it is possible to plant for more production, and I assume for more vine density further west compared to further east. Is that right?
I would say that you can create production vineyards all over Lodi, but it would be, I think, easier. You have the potential, because of your water situation and the youthfulness of the soils on the west side, to create production vineyards. Right. But the west side's really super hard to farm. It's probably one of the hardest places to farm in Lodi, because just like with grapes, if you're not careful, they're going to get big and vigorous on you. So do all of the weeds. So do all of the grasses. Yeah. And I'm a newcomer to the Delta, and I have been humbled by how difficult it is to grow in the Delta for quality or production, because there's so many competing factors that, that we don't have on the east side.
Right. No, thank you. Okay, so let's get back to wines. We want to manage time here too and talk about the wines. And so Jay, looking at Oak Farm Albarino, I'll tell us a little bit about the wine, but let's talk about the wine itself first. What are your first impressions kind of smelling and tasting this Albarino?
Again, just another really pretty cool wine. I get a lot of really fresh citrus on this right off the bat. I get tangerine, I get orange, I also get a lot of peach. This thing blows peach, apricot. There's a hint of vanilla bean here, I think from Lee's contact, a little bit of fresh baked bread. There's kind of a rocky, ozony minerality that comes through. On the palate, it comes through a little tartar on medium plus acid, really clean, really refreshing. Again, more citrus dominated to me, more tangerine-y, but that peach is just there as well. Super clean. There's a really nice peach blossom, apple blossom, kind of a floral minerality or floral tone to it, even a touch of somewhat of a sea spray kind of smell to it. And really, really pretty and enjoyable. So I think this wine is driven by its beautiful fruit. And again, I'm guessing there's lees on here because there's that nice bread yeast and vanilla coming through on the back end. Delicious.
So part of what they've been able to do with this oak farm, as I said, Markus actually established Albarino in Lodi, and people quickly realized he was a very smart man. And so there's now a pretty good amount of Albarino planted in all different growing zones of Lodi, which is really fun and exciting to see. And I actually would recommend people that have the time, it's worth doing a big Lodi Albarino tasting or even an in-person Lodi Albarino tour. But one of the things that Oak Farm has done with this particular wine is that they've actually brought together fruit from 3 different vineyards. And it very much goes back to Markus's point about how Albarino really gives very different aromatic conditions depending on soil type. So they have some fruit from a more clay-driven site, some fruit from a more silty-driven site, both very cool, closer on to the west side. And then the third site, they actually have brought fruit from Alta Mesa, which is just slightly warmer, and so that you end up with a real range of fruit expressions, but also a real range of aromatic expressions as well. And again, fantastic freshness and acid. And just to answer a question that has come in, we did also, some of you have seen a recent episode of Behind the Wines webinar that I did, and this is the same wine that was mentioned there, just to answer the question that came in. So I do have to manage time, and we'll kind of keep talking about different varieties that have come up, but let's go ahead and look at the third wine too. And now, Ben, you're actually farming this particular site. It's the Clinker Brick. This is Clinker Brick Grenache Blanc. And one of the things that's interesting about this particular wine to keep in mind, yesterday, Tegan shared some of the history of the Grenache family in California. And, do remember this is one of 4 Grenache varieties that has been in California for quite a long time. And this is also a variety that, Markus does quite a lot of work with the kind of Iberian Garnacha Blanca version, but we're looking at specifically at a Grenache Blanc here. And so tell us, Ben, about kind of Clinker Brick and the farming that's done for this particular wine.
Sure. Well, it comes from the Under the Sea Vineyard, and I think you can all smile now why we named it that, being it's 17 feet below sea level. But I would say the vineyard's probably on a 10x5 spacing. Rootstock, which was another question. We use the SO4 rootstock, which is not as vigorous, and it is water, not so water sensitive. So fantastic rootstock for that area. Our farming practices are very, very minimal, to be honest. We're big advocates for Lodi rules, and to meet some of the requirements, we've turned that vineyard into a non-till vineyard, which does fantastic in the Delta. Again, weed management becomes a little bit tough, but yeah, it does a great job out there. Canopy wise is early season, we get a lot of vigor. We do a little bit of shoot thinning and a little bit of leaf removal, but after, I would say, June, we are not doing much to the vineyard. It's on a bilateral system, which some people call it a California sprawl, but just to honor my father-in-law, He did not like California Sprawl. He wanted a better name for that. So he calls it the Dancing Ballerina, which allows the speckled sunlight to come through the leaves really through all of the day, and really does a fine job of helping with ripening, but preserving color and ripeness. So.
Well, and just very briefly, we should mention your father-in-law. I was lucky enough, and thank you, Ben, for setting it up. I was able to spend half a day or so with him, just hearing him tell stories about different varieties. But I want you to go ahead and just mention him by name, because he also did so much work bringing different varieties into Lodi. And I think growers don't often enough get acknowledged for how they've changed the industry. And so I'd really like to go ahead and mention him.
Yeah, Richard Ripken, back early 80s during phylloxera in Napa, he happened to have a rootstock nursery, and he was a supplier for a lot of California's rootstock after phylloxera scare, and really changed the way vines were planted and the quality of rootings in the area. So, an innovator with varietals and rootstock varietals.
Well, and so in terms of Grenache Blanc, I'm going to pull on both Sue and Markus here. But Sue, Grenache Blanc is something that, you're very happily working with at Acquiesce. And, Acquiesce is entirely white wine focused. I'm including rosé in that, but also entirely Rhone focused. And that's something for us to remember too, is some of these varieties, like Grenache Blanc is famously both in France and in Spain. And we can talk about the contrast around that a little bit. But so for you, coming from a Rhone white wine focused perspective, tell us about Grenache Blanc and Lodi and what you see predominantly come up with that variety.
Yeah, Grenache Blanc was the first grape that we planted, first white grape that we planted, and we were inspired by the Spanish version that Markus had planted in Lodi. We're in the Macallan River AVA. The east side, very close to where Markus lives, actually. And but it was my love of white Chateauneuf du Pape that was my inspiration for planting the varietals that we do have at Acquiesce. So like I said, the Grenache Blanc was the first one we planted. At the time, we weren't even thinking about opening a winery or that. It was kind of a home winemaker deal that we were doing at the time, and totally fell in love with it. We were amazed by the minerality, by the complexity of the varietal, and basically how well it pairs with food. So it's a great food wine, and we have 3 acres now, and it's a series of 3 different plantings. So we started with some head trained vines, a half acre, and then so thrilled with it, we planted another 1.5 acres, and then recently planted another acre. So we find that it's just lovely.
Yeah, no, such a beautiful wine. And Grenache Blanc does grow kind of the length of California. There's a good amount actually in Dry Creek and quite a bit down Central Coast, especially Santa Barbara County. But I feel like there's this mineral rockiness that's that I see in the Lodi expressions that I don't necessarily see in the other regions. And so Markus, could you, we don't want to neglect the Albarino either, but these 3 varieties that we've talked about so far, again, Grenache Blanc is very much known for Rhone, but it really has a proper home in Spain as well. And so these 3 varieties, what do you think are key takeaways for us for how they do in Lodi, and what it is for us to note about them varietally there?
Well, just real briefly, I would say that we think of, let's say, Grenache and where its origin is at, which is Spain, as somehow very significant. But in reality, if you think about it, Spain wasn't a country until 1492, and France wasn't France until the 13th century. And so Grenache was traveling all over the Mediterranean by those cultures and politics that existed at the time, which was the country of Occitan, Catalonia, Aragon. And they had a common language. They were mutually intelligible, not like French and Spanish today. And so Grenache got distributed through that whole area and found its home in many different areas, like, for example, Chateauneuf-du-Pape, and also the Terra Alta, which is the closest wine region from our home in Spain, Aragon, Rioja. So there's a lot more commonality. Today, through the perspective of the 21st century, we see Spain and France and Sardinia, but in reality, it was all, much more culturally common, shared stuff. So I love Grenache Blanc. It is one of my favorite varietals. It is true and dear to my heart, probably because there's so much of it planted in the Terra Alta, which is the region in Spain that grows grapes closest to our hometown. And that's why we named our vineyard Terra Alta here in Lodi. And I love a lot of that anise type of aromatics and white flower aromatics that it has. And you find that a lot, both in Europe, and you find that in Lodi, in those expressions. It has a lot of minerality. I just think it's a very versatile wine. A wine, though, that if you taste the grapes, they're like candy. They get better and better. And the natural thing is not to pick it and let it get more and more flavorful, but then it becomes a very awkward wine. So you have to be very disciplined and pick it also at lower degrees brix to go in the direction that I think the best Lodi Grenaches go. So, but all of these three wines, as you can see, have a lot of commonality in them. They have a lot of citrus-driven aromatics. They have stone fruit-driven aromatics. They have floral aromatics, and they have all very nice, clean, balanced acidity and texture. So. Yeah.
And so Jay, looking at this clinker brick Grenache Blanc, what are your impressions kind of through the aromatics and the palate?
Well, right off the bat, I got a really lifted floral kind of nose. So the first thing that got me was fresh flowers and that rocky minerality that came through. For fruit, I was getting kind of apricot, yellow pear, and green pear. And then I really picked up on this black licorice note. It just kind of came right through. And it's funny that Markus just talked about anise.
Yeah.
So this licorice thing kind of came through on the nose. Also some nice fresh herbs on there. The acid is clean, medium plus, on the lower end of medium plus. Typically these wines from France or Chateauneuf-du-Pape can be overripe and lower in acid and higher in alcohol. This is really fresh and clean. Get a lot of lemon, lime, and tangerine on the palate, just medium plus alcohol. That clean, rocky minerality comes through. I'm guessing there's lees on this wine as well. Perhaps some really old used oak on here, but it's really not, there's really not an oak image, but I do get a creaminess. Again, thinking maybe it's lees here, but it really has a nice, long, rich, full finish, but being a light bodied as well. I'm talking about a food wine. I think it really would go well with so many dishes. We could go chicken here. We could go full sea bass here. We could go bouillabaisse. We could even, this wine has a lot of flavor profiles. And I'm really excited that you guys are making these kind of wines in America, because typically, I'm going to go to Europe for my first course wines because they're fresher and lighter and not so powerful. And I think that, these wines are perfect for food. And I'm so happy that you guys are making them like this.
Well, I think the advantage Lodi has in terms of white wines is there's just enough heat during the day to develop the flavor profile, but then that cooling fog, which we talked about some yesterday, we haven't talked about as much today, but you get cooling nighttime fog and regular daily afternoon breezes, which help retain acidity. So you get that wonderful that like dream wine combination of actual real flavor, but then also really nice fresh length and acid. And I love seeing that. So the first three whites that we talked about.
Could Ben tell us how he actually made this wine?
So Ben is actually the grower, and I was just about to comment on the winemaking. So both the Albarino and the Grenache Blanc are entirely stainless steel, but they also are really intentionally long, cool, slow ferments. And so that is that long, cool, slow ferment really kind of layers in the fruit and kind of creates that sense of purity to the wine. Whole cluster press on both, and then, like I said, long, cool, slow ferments, but in stainless. So, but now, so I think Markus's point though about remembering the history of these regions, we're so used to talking about French wine, Spanish wine. But the truth is that very recent history, these areas were all connected in an entirely different way. And so there's a blending of traditions. But now when we do talk about traditions specifically to the Rhone, the Southern Rhone, which Sue referenced, is really importantly built in a tradition of blending varieties. And Sue, you do actually work with these different Rhone white varieties and bottle them on their own. And I want to make sure and point out that Acquiesce was actually the first winery in North America to grow, make, and bottle Bourg Blanc.
Yes.
Which is really fun and exciting. And it's not a super common variety in the world, but you were actually the first to bottle it in North America, which is really fun. And one of the traditions of the Southern Rhone is blending. And I know you really love blending whites. And so could you talk to us about how you approach that? We've talked about 3 different varieties singly, but you're actually bringing them together in the bottle. And this 4th wine, the Ingenue, is an example of one of your newer blends.
Yes, like I said, the white Chateauneuf de Pape wines that I fell in love with obviously were blends. It's very difficult to find a single varietal in Chateauneuf de Pape. I don't really know of any other than a Roussanne. So planting them individually, I thought was very interesting because you can't try them that way other places. And from day one, bringing them together was my goal. With Ingenue, I had originally wanted to put together the Clairette Blanche, the Picpoul Blanc, and the Bourg Blanc because it was a brand new planting of mine. And these were such unusual varietals. I wanted that to be the blend. So after doing about 20 different blending trials with different amounts of these wines, and it's basically all about the taste, really. Yeah. I realized I had to add Grenache Blanc to the profile to give it the mid palate I was looking for, or it would be, for my tastes, a little too acidic, too much on the acidic side. So we have 35% Clairette Blanche in this blend, 35% Grenache Blanc, 20% of the Bourg Blanc, and 10% of the Picpoul Blanc. And I think in so many ways, if you're really into wine and really into aromas, it makes your mind work a little bit overtime trying to get all the different aromas. And it makes it really fun for a winemaker to just smell, but to drink and to try with food. So we have another blend also that's called Belle Blanc, which is a Roussanne based blend and completely different in style, with the Roussanne being the dominant character.
Well, I have to say I'm a huge fan of quality Roussanne, and so definitely recommend tasting that wine as well. But you also make Roussanne available on its own in your tasting room. Yes. But I know one of your great loves though is actually the food pairing part, and you spend a lot of time in your own kitchen tasting your wines and putting it together with food before you then make recommendations in the tasting room. So with Ingenue, what is your favorite thing to put alongside of it?
Oh, well, it always goes back to where these grape varietals are originally grown. So I would go with goat cheese, duck, fish, so many different, this wine goes with so many different things. It's really hard to just come up with a couple. But anything definitely that is popular in France will go well with this wine. It was pretty interesting too about this wine in particular because we went to France a year and a half ago, and we came across a winery called Domaine Fine Roche, and they have all these same varietals in a blend. But the owner, who had been raised on the property in a beautiful castle, had never tried them single varietal. So they just co-ferment them. So they pick them and they co-ferment them, and had been doing that for 40 years, 50 years. And she had never tried them on their own. So to me, it's like, how do you know the right proportion to blend? If you are just given whatever in the field and you're putting it together, I think that being able to put a blend together in a winery with the ideal amounts of these varietals gives you the best of both worlds.
Well, and so working, again, you were the first person in North America to actually to bottle Bourg Blanc, but so then as a result to work with it, on the vine and then in the cellar. But like you just pointed out, people in France aren't bottling Bourg Blanc on its own. So was there anything about it that was a total surprise for you after working with these other whites?
Yeah, it took a couple of years to figure out like when you should pick it, when you're dealing with a varietal that you haven't even tried on its own. But knowing the history of Tablas Creek that brought these varietals over, and the fact that they are clones from Chateau Beaucastel, I knew that they would be lovely. But when do you pick them? So the first year we had a very small amount of Bourg Blanc. I felt like we picked it a little too early. It had too much of an acidic profile and not enough of a fruit profile. So the second year we let it hang out there a little longer. So it was a little bit riper, but still had a nice acidity to it. And so it's kind of a trial and error. And it was interesting. Well, thanks to the Lodi Winegrape Commission, when we planted these, the Claret Blanche and Bourg Blanc, there were several masters of wine that came out to taste them in the tank, because it's a rare thing to try them this way. And I just think on their own, they're lovely wines, and putting them together was just a really fun thing. The first year we did it, last year, we sold out in 2 weeks. We had about 250 cases and sold out right away. So I think our customers are also enjoying the same thing. But yeah.
Well, and so we'll talk about your winemaking for this specific wine in a minute, but we've just talked about 4 different white wines from Lodi. And are there aspects of white winemaking that you would like to really highlight as important to think about, or that makes a big impact on the wine? What stands out to you as important to talk about in that regard?
Well, I think there's several things that work for us. I think the soils, I think we get a lot of the minerality from the Macallan River soils. Our soils were actually river bottom before the Macallan River was dammed. So they're the sandy loam soils. And I believe that a lot of the characters of the wine come from that. I believe in walking the vineyard. I think everyone here can attest to that. After doing this for 15 years, you get to know these grapes intimately, and you know when they're ripe by tasting them. And so you can be fooled by Brix readings in the vineyard, but to actually taste them, you get to know it. And sometimes you go back and forth with others that are saying, no, it's ready to pick. And you just know it's not. It can go that little bit further to give you the flavor profiles that you're looking for. We farm with Lodi Rules, and Jonathan Wetmore and Aaron Shin farm our property for us, and they do an excellent job. We believe in cutting off a lot of the fruit. We're doing this just for us. We're not selling our fruit. We're doing it for a certain style I'm looking for. So we typically cut off between 1/3 and 1/2 of our crop every year. And we feel that it gives the crop that remains a nice intensity of flavor. When we're picking, we hand pick and we hand sort in the vineyard. And then I hand sort at the press. So I hand sort every grape cluster that goes into the press. We whole cluster press. We chill the juice, usually about 55 degrees. I use a designer Rhone style yeast that I think helps bring out a lot of these fruit profiles. And typically our fermentations take about 20 to 30 days and in chilled tanks. And we rack after that, and we keep the wine on the lees for about 6 months. So everything's stainless steel, there's no oak. And a lot of that is my preference. Most Chateauneuf de Pape wines have some oak to them, and I always prefer the ones that don't have oak. And so that's kind of where I feel that with Lodi, I think you get this great fruit forwardness with all wines, red, white, whatever. And I find that if you're not careful, the oak can take that away. And so no malolactic fermentation here, and also no oak content. So
I think that combination, just from kind of compiling tasting experience, what I've seen is that stainless steel helps derive this kind of purity of expression, but your use of lees gives just a little more flavor, presence, and weight, as Jay was referencing earlier. And then there's, using yeast with white wine intentionally can really be quite valuable because it helps keep the aromatics clear, and again with good transparency too. And so Jay, turning to the Acquiesce Ingenue, what stands out to you in terms of looking at aromatics and profile?
It's another just super cool wine here. A lot of minerality coming out of here. When I first smell it, I get peach pear, a yellow apple, just slight anise, peach blossom, lemon blossom. There's kind of a vanillin tone as well as kind of a light smoke on here. There's a greenness, a slight greenness, but it's more like, to me, like fennel or radicchio, like it's fresh, but it's not overpowering. On the palate, it comes through more apricot, lemon, and lime to me. There's a really smoky, long richness there that really comes through vanilla to me. And I was trying to think if it was, just leaves, but that vanillin coming through. I'm really thinking now that the whole cluster is bringing that vanilla in, that slight, almost in the last few wines. It's almost like there's a slight it gives it a richness. And I see that they do that in Spain and Chenin de Pop as well. They use the whole clusters, which absorbs some of the alcohol, but also gives it that kind of slight, slight oak profile. This wine is really long as well. It's really big and rich and powerful, but at the same time, light, cool wine, delicious. Thank you.
thank you.
Great. So it's so fun to focus on whites. I think there's such a range that can be found in white wine, and historically we've tended to focus on reds for a lot of wine, public wine conversations and seminars especially. But I love doing white wine seminars because there's actually really so much detail and complexity that can be gained from it. But we also, as you mentioned, Sue, you're there in Macallan River, but you're actually relatively close to the J-Hunt area. So we did pull up soil slides to, again, repeat a look at the Macallan River soils, but in contrast to J-Hunt as well. So if we could just pull that up. Markus or Ben, so this would be J-Hunt soils. Kayla, do we still have the Macallan River as well, just to see the contrast? Notice again, right away, the really significant color contrast, but also notice the fine, very, very fine particle size on the Macallan River. And then if we can go back to J-Hunt, which is, again, Sue is in Macallan River, but just a little bit north of her is the J-Hunt area. Ben or Markus, do you briefly want to comment on what it's important to remember about J-Hunt?
We have the Liberty Oaks Vineyard, which is on in the J-Hunt AVA and located on what's called the San Joaquin Soil Series, which importantly is the state soil of California, the San Joaquin Soil Series. And it is derived from these really old river benchlands that were affected by the Laguna Creek area and also Cosumnes River. And they just, these benches that were eroded over time. And they're really wonderful clay loams. And I don't have any white wines that grow on those soils. They're moderate vigor soils, no presence of cobble or gravel at all. Really nice for varietals in the way that they concentrate tannins with red varieties. Again, I can't talk to the whites because I don't grow any whites on the San Joaquin Soil Series. But what I can say is that our best Tempranieros, our most concentrated Tempranieros, derive from those very soils that you've just shown in the J-Hunt AVA.
That's great. Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, more on the farming. So what I do is we manage vineyards throughout most of these AVAs, or we supply services. And so when I'm planning my farming activities, I start very, very east after harvest and rush to get all my farming activities in before winter weather comes. And I work my way west just because of the types of soils. out east gets sticky and wet and muddy, and as you work west, you can tolerate some weather and rain. So part of our farming activities are planned around all these different AVAs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and at our vineyard too, there's a 4-acre parcel. We have an 18-acre property, these estate varieties, but there's a 4-acre parcel. And when we bought the property, that parcel didn't have any grapes on it. And that's the parcel that's closest to the Géhant. So there's some clay veining in that parcel. And that's where the tractor would get stuck in the wintertime. But the others, on the same property, which by Lodi standards, we have a very small vineyard. It's completely like beach sand. So just within that same property, you see the changes in the soil, and you can actually get up high and look at the grapes and see by their vigor what area the grapes are planted in.
Sue, and it goes back to what you said earlier of knowing your vineyard, walking your vineyard and being out in it, knowing your soil types and changes within the vineyard, and knowing ripeness of the different areas of your vineyard. I mean, we grow Viognier out in the Delta, and it's the last Viognier by weeks that we pick in this region. And I have to tell the winemakers before they're interested in purchasing the grapes that you need to be prepared that we're gonna be the last Viognier, and I know you're gonna want to get the wines in, the grapes in to make the wine, but you're gonna have to wait an extra 2 or 3 weeks because that's when our flavors come from. So I think you hit it right on, knowing your vineyards from the ground up.
Right, absolutely. So we're going to finish up looking at two reds, kind of the lighter side of reds today, and two different varieties. And so we're continuing with our conversation on kind of varietal diversity in Lodi. But as we do that, we're also going to kind of expand the conversation into Lodi rules and sustainability efforts there in Lodi, really importantly. But this first red wine that we're going to talk about, it's so much fun. And Stuart, I'm going to call on you to tell us a little bit more about the vineyard in a minute. But we're actually looking at Cinsault, which I know has gained a lot of popularity in the wine community recently. I think, part of what made Pinot so popular starting in the mid 2000s was not just that damn movie, to be plain about it, but also that it's this beautiful mid-weight kind of lighter side of red. And in the last 10 years or so, people have really started looking for other wines that hit that weight and that beautiful mid-weight lighter side of red. And Cinsault is such a classic example. But Kayla, if we could pull up this photo, early in the year, in the before times, I took my daughter out to Lodi and hired her to take portraits of growers around the region. And I have to admit, this is one of my very favorite photos. So Stuart, could you tell us what we're looking at here?
Well, it's Kevin Phillips looking like a crouching tiger in a vineyard here. But Kevin Phillips is the Phillips family of Michael David, and he's at Bechtold Vineyard, which is probably the oldest Cinsault vineyard in the world, and definitely in California. It's a 25-acre own-rooted, dry-farmed Cinsault vineyard on the Spencer Ranch, which is part of the Jesse's Grove property, just on the west side of Lodi here, and named after Al Bechtold, who was married to the family and farmed it for many, many years. One of the interesting things about this vineyard, and Tegan kind of touched on it yesterday, is that it was known and sold as Black Prince variety for many, many decades, and it was packed and shipped all around the world or country. And then in and around the early 2000s, I think it was Randall Graham started buying grapes out there, and they thought it was something else, and so they had UC Davis down to identify, and they actually identified it as Cinsault. And shortly thereafter, the Michael David family took over managing the property from the Bechtolds, and to Kevin and the Phillips family credit, they've continued to allow a bunch of other winemakers to source grapes from here. And so you've got, Turley makes a Cinsault that's from this vineyard, Bechtold Cinsault. Abe at the Sholeum Project has made wines from here. Locally, Fields family makes Cinsault from here. McKay family has done it, and then the Phillips family does the Cinsault, and several other vintners. And so it's truly one of these kind of, unicorn vineyards in the world of winemaking that you just like, how did this get here, and why is it here? And it makes these beautiful, pretty wines.
I mean, it's really quite remarkable. So Bechtold, it is actually confirmed as the oldest Cinsault vineyard in the world, planted in 1886, entirely own-rooted. So it is an ungrafted vineyard that has survived since 1886, which is really quite incredible. And even more remarkably, at the time when they finally realized that what they had was Cinsault, the fruit was being sold for almost no money at all. Just as packed fruit, and people were barely making wine from it. And so it's really quite a miracle it survived. But when Randall Graham started working with the site, he actually believed there was no Cinsault in California. We'd essentially lost the variety, and it turned out actually we'd had it for more than 100 years. So it's really an incredible story. And the thing I love about that photo of Kevin Phillips, any of us that know him, like, I don't know if the rest of you noticed, but the second that photo went up, we all started laughing. And he's just such a character. He's one of these people, you must love him. It's just the way the universe is built. You will love Kevin Phillips, but he might challenge you to love him a little bit when you first meet him. He tries to pretend he's aloof, but he's actually this wonderful dear man. But the thing about this photo I love is he's in the vineyard. This is, it's still in winter here, so there's not a lot of canopy growth, obviously, but look at the incredible flower growth. Though that reflects the kind of farming he's doing. And when you see a farmer go basically sit on the ground in the middle of their vineyard, they're doing really healthy farming, right? They're quite comfortable on their own soil. And so this, Kevin's actually doing organic farming, and he's strongly involved in sustainability efforts around Lodi. And so, before we talk about the wine itself, Ben and Markus, you both do a ton of work with Lodi rules. And so Ben, if we could start with you, just tell us some of the important basics for people to realize about Lodi rules.
Yeah, absolutely. I often get the question, why sustainability, why Lodi rules and not organic? And I like to answer with the Lodi rules program is a real holistic approach to sustainable farming, concentrating on, our neighbors, our environment, our economics, profitability, employees. And it's really a guideline for our core principles within our company. So, profitability, we have to be profitable for the next generation. If we don't make money, such as this Cinsault vineyard, if it didn't make money, it wouldn't survive. And so that's number one, we have to be profitable. Environmental issues, we all have limited resources. So being able to regenerate our soils and to renew our soils for the next generation, that's sustainability, right? It's not strictly focused on pesticide use, it's a holistic approach. We learn from being in our vineyards that Stu talked about it, and our employees are in the vineyard more than I am. And so empowering our employees through education and teaching them about issues to look for, that's how we get to know our vineyards as well. And really being involved in things like this within the industry. Lodi has the Lodi District Grape Growers. We have the Winegrape Commission. We have a wonderful youth programs. And we firmly believe within our operation that we need to give to our community, give back to our neighbors. Not only does giving make us feel good, but we learn so much from everybody else. And we get within the Lodi rules, we get points for all of those things. We cannot pass and be certified unless we pass each one of these issues that we discuss. So.
And so it's important to note, so Lodi Rules was actually founded in the 1990s and as a comprehensive program to assist growers and in a way to help them think holistically about the vineyard, but in a way that would also help them continuously track and look for improvement in their farming practices over time. I think that's a really important part of thinking about sustainability, is to remember we all start somewhere. The choice is to continue to improve over time. And Lodi Rules, really importantly, is designed to help people think for themselves about where they can do that. One of the things that I think we sometimes make a mistake about with, in wine media and wine trade is sometimes we assume there's one thing and that's the important thing and everybody needs to do that thing or they're not doing it right. Part of what Lodi Rules has done is to recognize this vineyard closer to the river is going to have incredibly different needs than this river on the slopes closer to the mountains. This river closer to the forest versus this river closer to the desert. Soil differences heavily impact farming choices, humidity, all these different factors. Also what work crews are available in your region. All of these factors vastly change what choices you can make. And so Lodi Rules is a comprehensive program in that it allows you to look at improvement areas and practices across the whole range of possible conditions you might have personally. So Lodi Rules was actually the first comprehensive third-party certified, so fully outside body certifying your participation in Lodi Rules. So it's actually the first comprehensive third-party certified sustainability program in the world, and has become now internationally followed. So other countries, Israel as an example, are using Lodi Rules as the basis of their sustainability. New York, some areas in New York are as well. But Markus, bringing up this idea of how there's all these different aspects. There's questions about pests, there's questions about disease, there's questions about other invasive species, plant species. There's the human factor, the financial factor. But one of the ways that you've worked with trying to improve sustainability in your vineyards, I've seen you actually collaborate with other groups that are trying to think about sustainability practices. And last year, one of the things I saw you doing in your vineyards that I thought was really interesting was you welcomed this sort of trial to look at pest as an actual bug control without spraying. So you actually did a bunch of work to see if there was a way to reduce pesticide need, but through other means that would because we do still actually, we have to be honest, right? Pests, different types of bugs can do inordinate damage to plants in general, and vines specifically in this case. But so could you tell us, just as an example of one way that we can think about sustainability, how you were able to work with people last year to avoid spraying while still doing pest control?
Yeah, we are currently in our second year of a research study combining the PCAs we work with, as well as the University of California, in trying to see what would be the most economically effective way of reducing or almost entirely eliminating something called the vine mealybug. So in this ever speedy world that we live in, not only are we zooming around pre-COVID around the world more and more, but we are also bringing invasive pests and sharing them on different continents more and more. And so when I got into the business, if you had an invasive pest, it might happen once every 4 or 5 years. Now we're basically getting them every other year. Pretty soon we're going to have invasive pests coming every year. The vine mealybug was one of these pests that reared its ugly head probably a decade ago, maybe more, I'm not exactly certain. And we, as a grower community, have had to adapt our farming practices specific to this one insect. And the reason why it was so important was that not only did this insect render the fruit unmarketable, but it also is a vector to viruses. And once you have a virus in a plant, you've got to get rid of that plant because you're never going to get the virus out. So controlling the bug allowed you to bring a marketable product to the winery, but it also allowed you to control virus spread in your vineyards. So the way to control the bug historically has been through insecticides. And Lodi Rules was a really, really good way of kind of framing the question. In Lodi Rules, there are 6 major chapters, of which if you fail any one of them, like Ben was referring to, you're kicked out. But the other thing is, how much pesticides or inputs are you putting in the vineyard, and what is their toxicity rating? So you have now not a qualified idea, but a really quantifiable idea of how many toxins am I putting in on a per acre basis. Insecticides are very toxic in the realm of pesticides. And so eliminating them or vastly reducing some of them through creative solutions is a great way of staying in Lodi rules and being more sustainable. What we found out was that there were new products coming onto the market, which were called pheromones. And pheromones are basically a chemical that's elicited by females to attract males in the insect world. And someone had discovered how to chemically synthesize the pheromone to vine mealybug. Then the question was, how do you get it out into the field? How do you market it to the growers? How do you create these studies that are so necessary for that type of adoption? And so that's one of the things we were doing. We were giving our vineyard as an opportunity to try some of these new technologies. And I by no means am the only one. There's a lot of very creative growers out there that have been doing the same research or conjunctively with universities. And so we would put these little tiny tabs, about 270 per acre. So that's basically for every vine, every third vine had a tab on it. And these tabs would send out these pheromones. And instead of the females sending out the pheromones, now there's these pheromones just impregnating all the air in the vineyard. And the males can't find the females. They get all lost, confused. And then because they can't find the females, then there's no reproduction, or very, very limited reproduction on the happenstance occasion that a male bumps into a female. So every day that female is not pregnant, once its eggs are ready to be impregnated, it stops eating. It starts consuming its own eggs. So every day that we gain by not having a male find a female, the population of new eggs that get fertilized diminishes roughly by half every day. So that's hugely significant. And on top of that, many males never find females. So we did this experiment, and what we found out over a 2-year period was that pheromonal control in vineyards was by far more successful than any conventional insecticide we'd ever used, and about cost equivalent. So I think that story speaks to a lot of things.
Yeah, it gets at a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you have Lodi rules, one of the things that Lodi rules taught me was attention to detail and attention to walking the vineyards more. That's exactly what Sue's been saying, what Ben's been saying. I think I needed Lodi rules to get me in there in the vineyard more. And then once you're in the vineyard more, then you can bring in the resources, say, I got a problem. And I know there are people out there that can help me solve this problem. So who are those people? How do I identify them? And then how do I get to work collaboratively?
Well, and the thing I love about the program is exactly that. It's a way of giving you a framework to now pay attention in the vineyard in a more thoroughgoing, detailed way. And it gives, because even the smartest people in the world, if they're only working on their own, their ability to track, notice, and solve problems is radically limited. And Lodi Rules is very much about people working together, compiling information, improving understanding. And something that I've seen really persistently across Lodi is exactly what you were just describing, with a willingness in growers to collaborate with outside researchers and even growers from other areas to share this kind of knowledge and in order to improve practices. And the truth is too, if we kind of reduce and eliminate the mealybug population, we're actually, reducing the chemical additions in the vineyard. The pheromone control tags, they're just little paper tags. They actually have no chemical impact in the vineyard at all. So notice you're not spraying anything, which is then also reducing tractor passes, which then reduces soil compaction, which reduces carbon output from the vehicle as well, right? But you're also then over time reducing your cost. And again, something we do a lot in wine media to hold myself accountable, but in the wine trade as well, is really focus on the romantic side of wine. But even the most romantic producer must be bringing in enough money to keep their farming and winemaking going. And what that means is even the most romantic producer with the fanciest, most flowery language is having to go out in the vineyard and make decisions like this. How do I deal with this pest? Or how do I control this disease issue? And so these are just really great examples of some of these thoughtful practices and how people are working together. And so now this last bit, we're going to focus on the 2 remaining wines. And we've talked about we used the Cinsault really to talk about farming. But let's go ahead and look at the Cinsault, and then we're going to talk about the red blend. We talked about blending with Sue, and we'll talk about blending reds as well. So there is Syrah mentioned there. This wine really is Cinsault. There's just a drop or two of Syrah simply because there's a few vines in the vineyard. So just to clarify, this is Cinsault. But Jay, just looking at this wine, what is it that stands out to you?
Right off the bat, kind of a really pretty medium ruby color. Smelling it, I think possible coal cluster. I really got a lot of fresh roses and violets, maraschino cherry, red plum, candy cherry, blackberry. There's a rock and sand component here. Little or no oak on the nose. Kind of a fresh leaves in the fall smell, a little bit of fresh basil. Palate-wise, medium plus acid, medium plus alcohol, nicely balanced. That red cherry and black cherry really coming through. A little tangerine and orange as well. Just medium tannins here. This is really clean and refreshing. On the palate, I'm thinking there might be some used oak here now. There's a vanilla on the back end, but really well integrated and not really what this wine is about. This wine's about fresh fruit. This wine is about cleanliness. There's a slight earthy component to it, but really fresh and clean. And again, really exciting to have a wine like this that's just not a cookie cutter wine of everything else we seem to make in Napa and Sonoma. Really refreshing, really clean, really nice finish on.
It's really a wonderfully drinkable red wine. Again, nice palate stimulation. So this wine is actually entirely destemmed, all older oak barrels, and so and aged for about 12 months. But again, notice how much complexity was implied in your description, and that really speaks to the complexity and kind of flavor detail and flavor concentration that very consistently comes with old vines. And again, these are the oldest Cinsault vines in the world. And so being able to taste a wine like this is really quite exciting because it is unique in the world to be able to get fruit from a vineyard like this. So let's go ahead and now look at the Domo, the last wine. And as we do this, I think, so this is this brand. So we have Markus Bokisch speaking. But so just to clarify, this last wine is from Markus Winery, not the same Markus. So different Markus, same first name. But Stuart, if you could tell us about Markus Winery and Markus Nigli, the winemaker as well.
Certainly, Elaine. And one is follow up on the Cinsault I was going to mention too is Tegan yesterday mentioned that the Abba family had an old Cinsault vineyard planted at their property too, but it was actually called Black Prince there. And so knew it was Cinsault. And I think in the late 90s, it was pulled out and replaced. So I think there were probably the other Black Prince vineyards or Cinsault in and around Lodi back in the early 1900s. But the interesting thing, so moving on to the Markus Nigli wine, the Domo we've got here, I think one of the things this reminds me of, and with Ben, Sue, and Markus here today, is that a region is more than just a place. It's also the people, and it takes people to make things happen, and it takes innovative individuals to make it happen. And Markus Nigli, the brainchild behind this wine, I think is one of those people. And one of the other unique aspects of Lodi that we haven't even discussed today is the Macallan Glen vineyard and this eclectic mix of 50 German varieties grown along the Macallan River right next door to Markus's house, Bokisch's house. And it was planted by a guy by the name of Bob Koth. And he was really struggling to sell the grapes. And he had Kerner and a few other of these German varieties. And Markus Nigli came to Lodi. He's a Swiss winemaker that ended up here. And he was intrigued by these German varieties he saw growing here. And so he's really, in my opinion, really helped kind of bring to life the Macallan Glen vineyard. And now there's a bunch of other winemakers sourcing grapes from that particular vineyard. And so I think his innovation in that regard and seeing the potential has really helped shine the light on Lodi. The particular wine we're tasting right now, the Marcus Domo, is a red blend. And I think it's about 67% Kerrigan from the Spencer Ranch, which is actually on the same property as the Bechtold Vineyard. And so it is across kind of the oak grove. And one of the things they've done at that ranch is they've kept this 40-acre natural oak grove in production there. That is the way the valley used to look, 200 years ago, with all these big 300-year-old trees. And so they have this old block of 1900 Kerrigan that forms the base of this wine. And then the balance is some Merlot from the Bora Vineyards Gill Creek Ranch, which is out east Macallan River area, out somewhat towards Sue's property. And then there is also a bit of Zinfandel thrown in here too, which is also out in that east part of Lodi as well.
Yes, thank you. So we did actually see a 100% Carignan wine yesterday, but it was also 100% whole cluster. And so, today we wanted to show kind of that lighter mouthwatering side of red wine from Lodi. And, as Jay mentioned yesterday, the Carignan we had yesterday had really incredible freshness and acidity, but really quite a different style. And so this really speaks to the kind of work that Marcus Neagley likes to do with blending, but also be kind of lightening his touch on winemaking to really kind of preserve that freshness and acidity. And so but then also being willing to play with blends. And so Jay, if you, what are your impressions here on looking at this red blend from Lodi?
Another really cool wine. I get kind of a meaty black plum, black cherry smoke thing on the palate. The fruit is fresh, but a little bit baked as well. More turned earth than rock on this wine. I got a nice vanilla, a hint of caramel here. For herbs, marjoram, I get some sage here, a hint of juniper. On the palate, that fruit really comes through with really nice ripe cherry, ripe blackberry, red and black plum. There's also this kind of orangey tangerine thing coming through as well. That vanilla comes through with some smoke and some smoked meat on the end of it. A long finish, well balanced wine, and rich, but not overly powerful. Also very delicious and really enjoyable. I think it'd be a tough blind for anybody. Yeah. But really well made, and again, I'm impressed.
Cool, thank you. I mean, I think too, this wine really speaks to what the comment that was made earlier about white wines, where again, it's delivering incredible flavor. My mouth is so lit up by flavor, but that fresh acidity and unbelievably long length. Again, these Lodi absolutely can deliver that combination. And in my mind, that's sort of a dream ideal to find in wines when possible. And it can be hard to find in wines, but getting ample flavor and long, fresh acidity together in the glass is really exciting to see. And that's something that I really see with this wine as well. So the Koth family, we have to, since Stuart brought them up, we normally do have a wine from Macallan Glen Vineyard, and we happen not to today, but it's an example of, we've been talking about these different kind of waves of immigration that we touched on yesterday, but we've also through today been talking about the host of different varieties and wine grapes from different parts of the world in Lodi. And so I just do want to briefly mention again, Macallan Glen Vineyard, farmed by the Koth family. It's actually the largest collection of German wine grapes in North America. He has this, he just calls it the German collection. And as you walk down the rows, every 5 vines or so, there's a little handmade wood plaque that has a different vine name. And it's just this like really thrilling, fun thing to do. You just like run down the rows and you see all these quirky little different varieties. I think he's got about 50 of them. But I asked Kayla to pull up the photo of him because it says so much about who this man is. I love this picture. So again, this winter, when I brought my daughter Rachel out to take portraits of the growers in Lodi, and he met us on his lawnmower, you know, because he's a little older now, and he's like, this is the easier way to get around. So he just cruises around, you know, around the whole area on his lawnmower. He's not mowing while he's on it. It's like his little tractor. He just cruises around. And so this is how he met us. He was there, and he quickly said hello, but barely, because the second we arrived, this is what he did. He was like, come on. And he like drove us down into the vineyard. We were there to see the vines. So that's what we did. Come on. And we drove through the vineyard and down the hill so we could see how close it was to the Macallan River itself, and talk through his history of why on earth he committed to all these German varieties. So it's just as a kind of final thing to look at, even though we don't have a Macallan Glen wine, I wanted us to see this, you know, yet another grower of Lodi. It's really a community of incredible people, of people that love working together, people that welcome others who are committed to doing good, so to speak. And I just really wanted to thank everyone for inviting me to guide you through 2 days of Lodi intensive, and really thank Lodi for trusting me with so much time and to welcoming me into the community in that kind of way. And I hope that people feel like they've really gotten a good, strong glimpse of Lodi, the wines, its potential. You know, Jay, you've done such a great job of sharing your thoughts and you know, admitting you're learning here too, which I think we're all learning here. And so it's been great to hear your thoughts on the wines. And I thought, you know, just as we get ready to close, is now that you've had 2 days of Lodi talk and 2 days of Lodi wines, do you have final thoughts you'd like to share, your impressions on Lodi wines from the master sommelier perspective?
First of all, again, I'm overly impressed. And I, again, have to say it at all my trips around the world and in California, Oregon, Washington, North America, I have never visited Lodi winemaking region. So I am now going to put this on my first stop. And the next time I have the opportunity, I want to promote and sell these wines and taste these wines. And I'm excited. I thanks so much for all that I've learned the last few days and reading up on Lodi myself for the last few weeks. I'm amazed and super impressed. And it's going to be on the top of my list to recommend, to sell, and to visit. So thank you. And thank you again for doing such a great job. Thanks for all the panelists. Thank you, Stuart, for all your knowledge, and Ben, your knowledge, and Markus and Sue. I can't wait to visit you in the near future when I'm allowed to do that.
Thank you. Sue, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to give before we sign off?
I just want to say, you know, I'm kind of a newcomer to it. I've only been here 20 years. I'm not a 6th, 7th, 8th generation farming family. And I can't believe how welcoming the community is. As a new winery, we would have other wineries say, you have to check out the new person. And, you know, the customer would say, you know, we don't drink white wines. I don't care. Go there, you know, try them. And we still have wine club members from those referrals. And that just gives you an idea of how open and welcoming the families are. And that helps bring a tight knit community. And I think that's why it works so well here.
Yeah, thank you. Ben, do you have final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I'm excited for everybody to come visit Lodi. When you come visit us, you're meeting with the growers, the winemakers, the vineyard owners, and the experience. When we get you here, I promise you will not want to leave, as you can tell with the wines. And thank you to everybody for joining in today.
And Markus, do you have final thoughts?
Yeah, I have to say that not being from Lodi originally myself, not even being from the US originally.
On Instagram Live through SommFoundation and the Lodi Winegrape Commission on Monday at 10 a.m. So make sure you tune in to find out who won.
Great. So
Thanks, everybody.
when you get to Lodi, be sure to look for local cheeses. Be sure to get Mexican food. There's some good cocktails in the area, and there's a few nice secret dive bars that are not to be missed. The next day when you wake up and you don't know what that 30 different bank charges of $5 to some unrecognized source, and you think someone's stolen your card, it's not. It's that you drank cocktails at the dive bar and kept going back to the jukebox. So keep that. That's a pro insider tip for you. Be careful about the jukebox at the dive bar. But otherwise, have a great trip when all of you are able to get out there. Thanks again, everybody. Stuart, I hand it back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Elaine. I think it was a fabulous thing. I think everybody got a lot out of it, and I can't say enough for what you did put forth into this. I think we all got something out of it, and we welcome everyone back to Lodi, hopefully soon when we get through this COVID mess, and we will be doing Somm trips in person again in the future. So stay tuned for information on that. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Jay, and my fellow growers and vintners today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.